Hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking about the future, and I think this is a very potentially disruptive future. I want to tell you about it, give you the context so you can understand what I'm talking about. See if you want to make any choices. Come on, let's go take a look. Hello everyone, Dr. Chris Martenson here. It's June 18th. We are on episode 11, I believe, 011. And today I'm going to be talking about something that's really important. So, should you tune in? This thing, when the last time it happened, it led to what we call the Arab Spring. And there were uprisings all across the Middle East. It also was one of the things that led to the great financial crisis. So, if you remember that, it was a pretty awkward time. Banks were close to failing. Stock markets had a lot of gyrations. So, what is this thing I'm talking about? Well, before we get there, I'm going to give you a little background because, well, we're talking about oil, one of my favorite subjects of all time. So, hey, I got my drawing tool out, I believe. Yeah, good. So first thing, peak oil. What is the term peak oil? It's the point at which peak output of all of Earth's petroleum is reached. That's it right here. It would be the peak. So it doesn't mean running out of oil. It means that you can produce slightly less and less and less oil for a very long time till you are actually out of economically recoverable oil. It's an important concept, but it's not the most important concept. Here's the most important concept. If you understand this, this can clearly change how you see the world and the steps you might take around that. And it relates to this idea of something called net energy. Let's start with very simple. I promised there'd be no math in this, but I lied. Super simple math, grade school math, very easy to understand. Here's an example. Let's imagine that we used a barrel of oil to, make a drill rig. We had to use a barrel of oil to mine some steel, to make the piping or whatever we had to do. We burned a barrel of oil, but we got 50 barrels back. We have 50 barrels returned. So that means we're way over here at this 50 on this chart. And if you look here, it says we have a 98% surplus. And so the math is 1 minus 1 divided by 50 equals 98%. That's our surplus. That's what we get. That surplus here, that's what you live on. That's what I live on. That's the available energy for consumption. And that's what we have. That's our economy. If you want an economy, you need a lot of green. And what's interesting is that in this story, there are all these legacy oil and gas fields we humans, 50, 60, 70 years ago, we would get 100-to-1 returns out of our oil investments. And we're still getting fantastic returns off of those. But new oil and gas discoveries, some of those might be all the way down here at maybe 15, 16-to-1, 18-to-1. You got your tar sands way over here at 3-to-1. But you notice something about this chart. If you see this, it's not exactly linear. Everything kind of goes along, and then all of a sudden it falls off a cliff. This is the energy cliff, the net energy cliff. And by the way, oil shale, which is different from shale oil, very confusing in the business. Maybe we should come up with better terms over there in the energy business. I'm looking at you, energy guys. But oil shale is that stuff that's locked in the Rockies. Shale oil is different. It actually has pretty good returns. Tar sands, you see, have fairly poor returns. But biofuels, a lot of them, temperate cellulosic biofuels, that's where we're converting corn and stuff into ethanol. Really low returns. And the reason it matters is there's a lot of thinking that when you're down on this part of the curve down here, you can't run your society as well. Which kind of makes sense. You need energy to run your society. You want as much green as possible. So the net energy is falling in the oil business. And we know that. And so there's a whole story there I don't have time to get into today. But if you understand the concepts of peak oil, that there's a peak of output, but even more importantly, there's a peak of net energy output, then you understand why this is such a critical story to understand. Because as you're going up that curve of net energy, there's more and more and more net energy. Do whatever you want with it. Drive a 6,000-pound vehicle 40 minutes to soccer practice. Set up businesses based on all services on services on services. Fine. It's when you get on the downside of that things really begin to change. I think we're pretty much close to that. That's what today's update is about. Here's another example, though. Let's imagine we used 1 barrel of oil and we got 1 back. Cool if you're in the energy business because you get to keep working, but uncool for the rest of us. That's why this chart at 1 crosses 0. Because once you're using 1 unit of energy to get 1, you might as well not even be doing that anymore. It's a waste of time. There's no surplus. There's 0 surplus for society, which means there's 0 for you, 0 for me. My job goes away. Your job goes away, right? So we care a lot about this, where we are on this net energy graph. Now, We have a couple of signs that we're getting into a period of oil tightness. This oil tightness is about to translate into much higher oil prices. First, let's start here. This is a chart of the price of what's called WTI, or West Texas Intermediate. It's a grade of crude. There are 50 or 60 grades of crude out there that you could buy. This is one. It has a price. What I want you to notice, though, is, sort of flatlined here for a little bit up through last year, but it's really just been carrying on and going very, very strong since late last fall. And in this chart, which is crazy, these crazy lows all the way down here at $15, now it's at 70. And my prediction is it's going to keep going, but not just my prediction, lots of people's predictions. The world doesn't run on West Texas Intermediate. The world really runs on an international grade. There's a blend of that called Brent. Brent is another one. It's like West Texas Intermediate is a blend of oil. You could order it. It'll show up in a tanker. Same thing with Brent. But Brent's really a world oil sort of a price. And here we can see the same dynamic where it's just been going up and up and up and up. And so there we are at $73 a barrel. And, that's just up from, barely half that last November. So this price of oil has given us a signal. And usually, what does the rising price mean? Well, it means that supplies and demands are not balanced as well as they used to be, supply and demand. So less supply for an equivalent amount of demand, or more demand with the same amount of supply. Either way, you see the rising price because demand is starting to exceed supply. Now, why might that be? This is where the story gets super interesting. I presented this to my subscribers over at Peak Prosperity last week. We're going to be talking about that this weekend, Saturday night. I'll give you more information on that in a second. This Saturday night on a live webinar, people are going to ask me whatever questions they want. This article really caught me coming out of the American Petroleum Institute. So these are the people who care most about oil prices. And they're asking the question here. This was an article that came out very recently, looks like February 24th down here. Is the world about to see an oil shortage? They're asking here. It's possible, they say. Couch it a little. It's possible we could, couching term, be headed for a shortfall in global oil supply as soon as next year. So that would be 2022. Pretty remarkable considering where oil demand was last spring, with economies slowing under the weight of the pandemic. Slowing. Some of them cratered, and oil consumption cratered, and the price of oil cratered, because oil is what's called an inelastic commodity. If demand goes up a tiny bit, prices go up. If supply goes down, prices go up. It's not like supply can fall by half and the price goes up 10%. Supply falls by a little bit and price shoots up a lot. So it's inelastic, they call it. Based on projected rising demand, the natural production decline from existing wells and decreases in drilling activity, really important, and industry investment, especially in the U.S., the world's oil needs could outpace production in 2022. An undersupply potentially could put upward pressure on costs, impacting consumers, manufacturers, and generally any process that utilizes oil, which is all of them. So this is actually really important. Let me just take some of this away so you can read it clearly. I like how they couch this. The world's oil needs could outpace production in 2022. That right there is a hair on fire kind of a saying. That is a really powerful statement right there. And then the statement that follows that, an undersupply potentially could put upward pressure on costs, is putting it very mildly. An undersupply puts enormous pressures on costs. And we have a model for that, which is called 2008. That's why I led with both the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011, and we talk about the Great Financial Crisis, which happened exactly in 2008, and there's a way I can connect those dots. But a little bit more in this article, really important, I want to cover with you quickly here today. Says U.S. global oil demand through mid-February 2021 nearly returned to pre-COVID-19 levels. Nearly. We're almost back to pre-COVID. So if you think the economy's just getting started and maybe it's about to get going again, this data says it's already cooking along, because oil demand is a great proxy for overall economic activity. With oil demand in the United States nearly back to pre-COVID levels, baby, the economy is back. As well, they say, by all indications, global oil demand exceeded supply and supported prices since the third quarter of 2020. So third quarter 2020, I showed you how prices have been on a climb since November of 2020. That's the third quarter, end of third quarter, early fourth quarter. We saw the price just take off on that, right? So if anytime you see supply being exceeded by demand, you get a very sharp increase in prices, right? Even if it's just a tiny bit. We saw this in 2008, right before oil hit $147 a barrel. We saw that supply was exceeded by demand for 5 out of 6 quarters. That's all it took, but it was just a tiny bit. It wasn't like badly exceeded. It was like 1 million barrels a day, 500,000 barrels a day. Tiny little rounding errors, but they're really important in the oil market. When the oil market detects any tightness at all, prices go parabolic. If this article is correct, we're going to see very, very sharp rises of prices of oil in 2022, and that's something you need to be prepared for because that's going to impact, well, everything that's impacted by oil, which again, pretty much everything. They say here current official global oil demand projections through 2022 call for record 2-year demand growth. Record 2-year demand growth that could require virtually all the world's oil spare production capacity. So the world always has a little spare production capacity. If this is what's producing it, has a little spare. This is the spare. If we eat into that and there's no extra spare, there's no room for error in this story. One bad war, one even minor war, one outbreak of a tanker getting caught sideways in the Suez Canal, anything could disrupt that and create pretty extreme explosions in prices at that point. Additionally, oil production declines naturally, and that production must be replaced. So every year, the amount of oil we're producing, it's falling because all those wells are old and they get tired, and you go past that curve and oil production falls. Happens in all the wells. So you have to replace that. And combine that expected decline with projected demand growth, so those two pressures right there, decline in existing output plus demand growth, and the world could require more than 14 million barrels a day of new production by 2022. That's going to be a tall order. That is going to be really hard for all sorts of reasons. A, there aren't really that many good prospects left to drill. B, oil companies are just getting pilloried in the press. C, they just took major capital hits. D, the oil business is going to be a little bit gun shy after all of those gyrations, and they're going to come back a little bit more slowly than they have in the past. So all of those are say that investment in oil might not be what we need to get 14 million barrels a day in new production. All I'm trying to get you ready for is much higher gas prices and oil prices. And global oil drilling activity and capital investments have remained historically weak, suggesting a potential supply gap. I'll be stronger in that. Great article just came out. David Messier, I'm going to see if I can get him on the program, if he'd be willing to come on, because this was a great article. Love how he put this piece together. Asking the question, no, I asked, is it already too late? He's being declarative. He says it's too late to avoid a major oil supply crisis, and he's got a thesis in here that he lays out. Pretty cool, but it rests on just this, which is annual global spending on oil extraction went from a high here of around $800 billion back here in 2014, all the way collapsed down to barely $300 billion here in 2020. They're projecting a little growth in that this year. Might happen. But this was just an absolute destruction of capital investment in the oil business. And it's a capital-intensive business. You have to constantly be pouring money back into oil in order to get more oil out of the ground. This is where we're going to be missing those 14 million barrels a day. Those should have been drilled back here. The idea that we're going to have to create 14 million barrels a day of new production by here with this level of capital investment, folks, it ain't going to happen. So that's the thesis right there. Carrying on, in this article, David writes, in fact, an article carried in the Wall Street Journal noted that planned investment in oil supply globally falls about 600 billion with a B short of what will be needed to meet projected demand by 2030. So 600 billion short. That's a huge amount. Trust me, you can get a lot of oil out of the ground for 600 billion. Ain't going to happen, they're saying here. And they say pressure to deliver cash to shareholders, partly driven by worries about the long-run outlook in oil demand, which we've been hearing about, has limited the industry's ability to plow money into new projects, he said. This reasoning was seconded in the article by another analyst. And of course, we just saw that Exxon on its board has not one, but 2 and possibly 3 now people who are coming in with an activist bent of saying, hey, let's do less of that oil investment and stuff like that. Let's go more into green energy. All of these are just a cauldron of pressures for why we're going to see less investment, so we're going to have less output at a time when we're seeing very strongly rising demand. That is a recipe for much higher prices. It's just hard to see carrying on here where the capital is going to come from and grow at a rate that will be needed from 2022. I think it's going to bite just a little earlier than that. And they say here that this hedge fund, of course, positioning for higher oil prices through futures and options. To summarize, in an amazingly short period of time, the world has made an irreversible bet on green energy sources, solar, wind, and biofuels, being able to shoulder much of its energy burden. This is a transition without a track record and a very spotty roadmap of implementation. Time will tell if this will pay off. If my judgment is correct, we won't have long to find out. This is a very, very big bet. It's one that you need to at least be hedged for. Let's all hope that we have this wonderful energy transition. We do it really seamlessly. This is all fretting for nothing. Turns out we didn't need oil after all. But if we do, and any of that's wrong, you need to be ready for what that's going to imply, and there are huge implications, and that's why we're going to be talking about this in this webinar this weekend at my website, because it's a huge question. It's a big question. Question is this: how does your life change if or when oil doubles in price? Just setting a target. What if it doubles in price? That's in the U.S., $6 a gallon gasoline, more or less, $2.50 a liter in Canada. Well, I'll tell you how it changes for some people. Not at all. You know, they're very rich. They're part of the 1%, all that. For other people, it's just devastating. You know, the people who are already barely stretching their budget, who had to live because of rising house prices. Thank you, Federal Reserve. They had to live really far away from their jobs, so their fuel cost is actually a non-insignificant portion of their overall budget. This is going to break some budgets when we go out there. All of which is to say, you know, what is the response to something like rapidly rising oil prices? You got to build resilience in. So this is our model for building resilience here. You want to build all of these 8 forms of capital. That's our model at Peak Prosperity. Financial capital, just one of them. Living capital, material capital, knowledge. So right there in that living, material, knowledge capital, those 3 are going to be really important in a sea of rising oil prices, because everything goes up as a consequence of that. And certain things break down. We wonder what the impacts are going to be on farming, on food production, on the overall economy, the ability of people to weather the storm, how much money printing is going to have to be done to sort of patch in the gap, by which I mean a lot of people might end up out of work. What do you think is going to happen then? Well, we already know how to do this. We have universal basic income. We got stimulus checks. We'll take care. Right now we've learned that we can just print money as much as we want, and next thing you know, everything seems to work out. They will keep running that model until it breaks. And what is going to cause it to break? Nothing inside the model. There's nobody in Washington, D.C. or the Federal Reserve is going to wake up one day and go, what are we doing? Maybe we shouldn't. They'll just keep printing. Oil is the number one thing that's the exogenous, the outside force that could come in and break that model open. This is what I put my money on from a intellectual standpoint of thinking through what could cause the current system of just printing money and throwing it into markets. What could cause that to break? A rapidly rising oil price. And by the way, that was the thing, a rapidly rising oil price. We saw this oil price spike up into 2008, $147 a barrel in July of 2008. By October, the markets had crumbled, and this caused a huge input price rise in oil-related things, including food, including everything related to, say, wheat and corn and all that staple crop stuff. And next thing you knew, bread cost too much in Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and we had what was called the Arab Spring because of food price rises that were themselves driven by oil price rises. So that's why we keep such a close eye on the master resource. This is a very short course in this. If you want to find out more about this, go to the crash course, Understanding Oil and how oil is, or how energy is the economy and what energy economics is. Super important. All right, remember, folks, it didn't have to be this way, and we all have a part to play in reclaiming the future and empowering resilience. And you're the reason that we're here and able to do this at all. So thank you to everybody who's been listening, and to our supporters, of course, especially our subscribers. And we have another ask of you today. Continue to share our content with 5 people who need to hear the kind of information we provide here at Peak Prosperity. The only way we win this battle is by making as many people as possible aware of the true nature of the issues and predicaments that we're facing and what they can do to make a positive impact now. Hey, that's it for now. We'll see you next time, and many of you hopefully at Polyface and or at this weekend's webinar. Hey, goodbye, everybody. And if you want to find out about this webinar, please just click this link right here, and that will take you right to a landing page special for us here on YouTube, for our YouTube subscribers. So you will find out more about it there. Hey, we'll see you next time. Bye.